Ahoy there, jabronis. Welcome to Create and Destroy. I'm your host, Dan Donnarumma. This is the 46th and last episode of the podcast. Very bittersweet. Still trying to grapple and come to terms with my decision to end the podcast. It was a tough decision for me. I thought about it a ton, and it was a decision that I didn't make lightly. But I feel like the time is appropriate, even if I feel bummed, and I know I'm going to feel bummed in the future once the podcast is no longer a show. But I do think that the timing is appropriate at this point. I have to say that the podcast wound up being such a great experience for me. When I started this just over 2 years ago now, it was something that I didn't envision would get to the point that it's at now. There were a lot of anxieties that I had over doing this just because it was something completely brand new for me. I never did anything related to audio recording, mixing, mastering, none of that stuff. I had to figure out how to do a lot of stuff that I never did previously, and I was lucky enough to have a buddy of mine, Tim Vetter, who does a podcast, help me with a lot of things, connect me to a couple people that could help me out with stuff. But then eventually this podcast just became me doing everything, and even though that was a little overwhelming and daunting at first, as time went on, it became just kind of, you figure it out as you go, trial by fire sort of a thing. And I'm very, very happy that I did this, and I am so grateful of all of the connections that I've made in doing this podcast. I've gotten to meet and speak to and befriend a bunch of people that I never would have otherwise. I've gotten to do interviews with people from other countries, from various parts of America. I've gotten to cultivate friendships with people from other countries and from other parts of America that, again, I would never have otherwise had I not done this podcast. And so even though the podcast is coming to an end, I am super freaking grateful of what this podcast has done for me. I'm happy with how things went during the 2 years of doing this podcast. And I have to say, I'm going to boast a little bit, kind of proud of myself. I remember when I released the first episode of this podcast, no joke, it took me like 3 hours to record. It was maybe like a 10-minute, 15-minute segment. Now, something like what I'm doing right now, I'm just flying off the cuff here. I have no notes prepared, and it's become just second nature for me, and I'm not anxious by this. And that is something that when I first started seemed like it would be impossible for me to do this and not feel anxious about putting something out there for people to listen to and enjoy and not make me get super sweaty from anxiety. Another thing that I'm grateful for in doing this podcast is, again, having various artists and various musicians come onto the show is getting insight into what they do and the care and the attention and the sweat and blood that goes into making their art. That's one of the things that I've always loved about music, especially as I've gotten older and have gotten into some of the bands and the artists that I've gotten into. Making music, making art that is worthwhile and challenging in whatever way is so important, and I think is something that has completely compounded my gratitude for music and for, again, the musicians and the artists that I've had come on to the show, because I've been able to hear from them and get that insight into what it takes to make the music and the art that they're making. And that's something that I am super appreciative of. So this is all a long-winded way for me to say thank you guys for everything. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Thank you to those individuals who came onto the show, who allowed me to bother them and let me pester them. That will forever be something that I'm super grateful for. And again, I'm super grateful to all of you that have listened to this podcast over these 2 years and have reached out to me and have talked to me, because this podcast will always be something super special to me and super meaningful to me. And these 2 years will be something that I'll look back on, and I'll be super happy and super proud of it. So thank you to everyone. It means a ton to me that there were actually people that gave a shit about this damn podcast and me just flapping my gums. So thank you guys so much. With all of that out of the way, let's talk about my guest, my last guest for the show. And I couldn't be happier for my guest for you guys today is Adam Washington. And Adam Washington is such a goddamn super nice and talented individual. He's been a longtime supporter of the show, and he's just fucking awesome. So as I mentioned, Adam is a writer. He has created the Misophorism Trilogy, which if you haven't read it, it's something that I would highly recommend, especially if you enjoy a lot of the Flenser artists that delve into themes of depression, maybe some themes about death, just some bleak shit. I think you'll like Adam's writing. The Flenser has put out his work, and I think his work is so fitting for the Flenser, and I feel like it's a perfect place for Adam's work to be published, because Adam is a big Flenser fan. So what's cool is not only did he and I talk about his writing, what's inspired him over the years, how he creates the work that he creates, but we also talked about the Flenser and what makes the Flenser such a special record label. And I felt like what a fitting individual to have onto the podcast for the last episode, to be able to talk about his work, as well as to talk about the Flenser, which is, as you guys know, a very special record label for me. So I just felt like Adam was the perfect individual to have onto the podcast for the show's final episode. So let's get into it, guys. Here's my conversation with Adam Washington. All right, Adam. So before we get started, I just wanted to say how excited I am to have you on the podcast. You're the first non-musician individual I've been able to have on the show in a while. And also, you're just as big of a Flens head as I am. So of course, I couldn't wait to talk about music with you. So thank you so much for coming on to the show, man.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, this is exciting, man. So before we get into your writing and kind of what you've been working on, I first wanted to talk about kind of how you've been holding up with the pandemic and the protests that have been gripping the globe.
With the pandemic, it's been all right, I guess. It hasn't been too hard on me, but sort of like I've been out of work. So sitting around doing nothing all day and trying to fill the time is exhausting in itself when you don't have anything to do. And as far as the protest, I mean, like, it's a thing where I support the protest and I want them to happen, and I'm glad they're happening. But it's just seeing all the racism come out and all of the stupid bullshit from right-wingers that is incredibly taxing in a way.
Oh my God,
like,
right?
Yeah, like, especially, being black and seeing not only just like all of the police brutality on Twitter and all of the names of people like me who have been killed by the police unjustly, is, a harrowing reminder of my reality. And I'm glad those names are being said, and they should be said, but it's still like, I can see myself in every one of their shoes, and that is scary.
I can't even imagine, dude. So my wife and I just a couple days ago on Sunday, we were like fucking shot. Just because of everything that's been going on, we felt so emotionally drained and taxed. And my wife said something to me. She said to me, imagine being a person of color and you have to deal with this on a daily fucking basis. I was just like, holy shit. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I can't even imagine what that stress must be like for people of color that are dealing with this on a constant fucking basis.
Yeah, especially like having that awareness in the back of your mind that police are not to be trusted if you're a person of color, or really just in general, but especially if you're a person of color. And seeing that in the public consciousness is nice. But then, like, it's like you said, people are getting tired of it. It's exhausting. And that's just the daily reality for me. And there's part of me that puts it in the back of my mind and doesn't think about it as much as I can. But, just like it pops back up if I see a police officer in public. So it is definitely exhausting to live with all the time. But I managed to suppress it, I guess, in a way when it is not, I don't want to say relevant, but it is not in the forefront of my mind.
I can't even imagine, dude. And so you live in Virginia. What's it been like in Virginia? Has things been crazy down there?
It's sort of, I know police tear gassed peaceful protesters in Richmond some time ago, and the RPD at first was on Twitter talking about how they had to do it, and then, if I remember correctly, they were saying that they had to, and then later saying the use of tear gas was unauthorized and they were going to discipline the police officers involved, but they didn't say anything about firing them. So that happened, and I know also they lit a Columbus statue on fire.
Yes, dude, I just saw that. I saw that this morning. I was like, yo, I think that's awesome as hell.
Yeah, it was pretty fucking sick. And they also pushed it into the water.
Yes, dude. Yeah. So it's crazy, man. Like, there's so many cities across the globe where people are destroying statues of these racist sons of bitches, which is awesome. Although I did see, correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't know if you've seen this, but I think the Supreme Court in Virginia might have turned down a request to remove a Robert E. Lee statue, which is a bummer. But still, the fact that all these other places are, and in Richmond with the Columbus statue, tearing down statues of racist pieces of shit, that's definitely something to be happy about.
Yeah, it's fucking awesome to see. I know with the Lee statue, we were going to have it removed. I think something happened recently that allowed the state to finally remove it, and somebody sued as like a descendant of the people who put up the statue or something. So now it's caught up in legislation. I think they might be able to do it eventually, but they have to deal with that, which is annoying and bummer, like you said, but hopefully eventually.
I'm just thinking, like, imagine being a descendant of Robert E. Lee and being like, yeah, I'm going to challenge the decision to remove a statue, and not seeing that there's something fucking wrong with that. Like, what the hell, man? So ridiculous.
Yeah. And, like, if I remember correctly, those statues were not even put up by Confederates. They were put up by racists later in, like, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, around that area, as sort of like a reminder of people of color to sort of, quote, know their place, unquote, which is, like, it's disgusting. Like, they would be disgusting in themselves, but the fact that they were put up for that reason is even more disgusting.
Oh, absolutely, dude. I just really hope that the protests that have been happening, I mean, there's been so much change in just like the handful of weeks that this has started. So I hope that people continue and press on, and that there is some serious change that comes from it, because, yeah, we are long overdue for it here in America.
Oh, yeah.
Have you found it tough to find motivation during this time to work on material or to work on stuff? Has it just been too taxing on you?
During, like, I think March and April, it was really fucking tough to find motivation to do anything. So I had sort of finished with my second book, and my third book I had also finished, but just have not edited it at all. It's just been sitting there, and I've been trying to start on something new for a while now, and I kept scrapping concept after concept, and I think I finally settled on one. But yeah, it was pretty hard to drum up motivation to do anything. And, you know, especially seeing, like I said, all the racism and stuff, that is like taxing on your energy in a weird way. Like, even if you have motivation to go do something, you go on Twitter or something and see racist everywhere, it makes you just sort of want to do nothing.
Let's say, I guess, in a time when COVID wasn't a thing and these protests weren't happening, does motivation come fairly easy to you? Do you find it tough to be motivated to work on stuff?
It really depends on the time period. So I have bipolar disorder too, and there will be times where I'm like super energized and really want to work on something. I think I wrote both my second book and third book in like 4 months because of that. But
Really?
there will be times when I just can't do anything at all. And sometimes, listening to music or something really drums it up, and I get to working, or reading something really good drums it up. But I would say generally, I have to really force myself to work. But I usually, once I get going, I'm usually able to do it,
In those several months when you were like pounding out stuff, how many hours would you say would you typically be working on writing material?
Like a day?
Yeah.
Probably 3 or 4 hours.
Wow. So, and what would that look like? Would you go and sit down and say to yourself, all right, I have an idea of what I'm planning to write today? Or is it, I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to type and kind of let whatever comes out just come out?
It's sort of a thing where, so like, I don't usually work on like small tidbits anymore. I have a project I'm working on and sort of have like a main project that I'm planning on really doing something with. And then I have a filler project that if I don't have a concept in mind at the time, I can work on that filler project in order to actually get some writing done. And if I'm sitting down to write a main project, usually it's I open up the file and I try to stay off my phone, and I'm not always successful. But I usually have the plot planned out in my notebook so I know where it's going. And so I just sit there and try to come up with different ways to word what I'm saying and just type away. Just typing away for several hours if I can.
So do you, like, whenever you leave the house or if you're going place, do you typically bring a book with you to jot down notes or jot down ideas?
I don't bring a notebook, but I use like the notes app on my phone, or I just straight up use my hand. I do that a lot, which, it's hard to get the ink out of your hand. Mm-hmm. But like if I really come up with something and I don't want to forget it, I just scribble it down on my hand.
Yeah.
Or scribble.
I know you mentioned music as one tool for motivation for you. Is there anything else or any other things that helps motivate you and get your ass in gear?
In the moment, I would say if I'm reading something and I see a really good line. I was reading The Savage God, A Study of Suicide recently, and there were just so many good lines in that book that would be like, I have got to come up with some shit that's as cool as this. And so I come to my computer and start writing. But there's music, there's reading, and sometimes having a conversation with someone will really get those gears turning. Yeah, a lot of the times I just have to be like, all right, I'm going to write now, and make myself do it.
Dude, it's weird, man, because I write poetry, and as I was preparing the questions for our interview, I was talking to my wife about this. I've had a very difficult time in the last several months of writing, and a big part of that is mentally I've been doing really fucking well, and I feel like it's very tough for me to find inspiration to write when I am in a pretty good headspace.
Yeah.
And what I've tried to do in the past when I've gotten into phases where I can't write is I'll just say, okay, I'm going to sit down for like 10 or 15 minutes. I'm just going to write whatever the fuck comes to mind and see what comes out. But I feel like for me, it's almost like I love Charles Bukowski, and I watched this interview he did where he was saying writer's block or finding inspiration is like a fly up in the corner of the top of your room and you can't reach it until it comes down to you. And that's how I fucking feel right now, which sucks so much because I love writing. When you're in those moments when you're having difficulty, what do you do to kind of get over that hump?
Recently, I've been doing this thing my friend Lexi Roberts told me about called automatic writing. And basically it's like this surrealist thing where you just go to whatever you write in and write. Like, don't even think about it. Don't plan anything out. Don't try to make it a piece. Just write. And it's like stream of thought, but more raw than stream of thought. And it's supposed to, like, get to the core of your consciousness and show you the real you. But by writing like that and just getting something out, I feel like that sort of gets those juices flowing, those creative juices in your head flowing better so you can actually go and write a project. But in doing that, you are still, like, creating a piece. And by doing the automatic writing, you could also take out pieces from that are worded well or are just fucking cool and put it in a poem or something. So that's what I've been doing recently. I think in the past when I've had writer's block, it was similar to that, just coming and writing something, but I would try to make it more conscious. And if it's in a project and I have writer's block, my best friend, Gavin Swanson, he proofreads all of my projects before I send them to anyone. So I will, like, call him and I'm like, Gavin, I don't know what the fuck to do. And have him give me an idea. So he helps me a lot.
That's awesome that he does that for you.
Yeah, he's been my best friend for a number of years, and it's been a long time now, but I've sent him pretty much every project. I know I sent him the Misophorism trilogy. I sent him my second book, and I haven't sent my third yet because I haven't edited it. I've written a bunch of screenplays, and he's read pretty much all of those. So he used to be a copy editor for a newspaper in high school, and I think maybe in college. So he really helps point out some shit that I can't see with my own eye, and I wouldn't be able to do writing formally, at least right now, without him. So he's awesome.
Dude, that's dope. Does he give you critiques and feedback, or is it just, hey, I think maybe you should focus on this stuff, or what exactly is that like when he's providing you with some feedback?
It varies on the project. I know I wrote this screenplay that I never put out, and I sent it to him, and he's like not afraid to tell me if it's bad. So I sent it, and I called him, and I was like, Gavin, is this good? And he was like, it could be a lot stronger. And so he'll like break down exactly what's wrong with it and how I can improve it. And with that project, it was that the dialogue wasn't super focused and I needed to add this and that and what else. But with the Misophorism trilogy, he basically gave me ideas when I couldn't strum up any. And when I sent it to him, tried to find typos and all that, he really gets on my ass about commas and em dashes and shit like that, just grammatical stuff. But a lot of the times, if I'm coming up with a plot or something, me and him will hop in like a call or something and hammer out the entire plot. And I'm sure he was kind of salty that I scrapped my last two concepts because we spent like 2 or 3 hours planning those out. But yeah, he basically helps me start with every single project. I think with my second book, To Sing of Damnation, I left him out of it until I was like 2/3 of the way through the book. Then I told him about it. And he was really with it. He didn't have any complaints then, which is like... I was expecting him to, because he usually does, but he didn't then, and I was happy about that.
So, dude, that's awesome. So it sounds like he's a big part, maybe not a big part, but he's a big help in your writing and the material that you've been able to release thus far.
Yeah, definitely. I basically got my start writing. Well, I got it when I was really young, but I mean, like, formal writing. He was there for most of it, and yeah, wouldn't be able to do it without him, really.
That's really cool, man. So yeah, that brings up a good question. When did you start writing and kind of get the itch to write stuff?
I was really, really young. I usually say like 7 years old just because that's a guess. I don't know when it really was. But I used to come into elementary school with these composition notebooks filled with like comic books and stuff and show them to the class, and people would read them, or kids would read them. I have no idea if they actually liked them, but they would read them. And I had like this ongoing series, and I would like write the book and come to class and be like, I have the next edition, and people would read it. And that just sort of stayed with me until now. And it's almost like writing is a need for me. Like, it's as essential as eating and sleeping because I've done it for so long. So I wouldn't be able to say exactly when it started, but it's just been there like my whole life. I don't think I could survive without creating.
Do you know where that interest stems from?
That's a good question. I think now it comes from this need for catharsis. So most of what I write is pretty fucking bleak and dark because, you know, I have a lot to say because I'm feeling such negative emotions sometimes. So I'm like, I need to get that off of my chest somehow. And writing is very much a mechanism of which I can do that. And when I was younger, I'm not sure it was entirely different. Maybe when I was a young kid, it was different, of just like wanting to show off what I could do. And I know I sort of ripped off my favorite characters at the time for my books. So maybe I just saw my favorite media as a kid and thought it was cool and wanted to do something similar. But now it really does come from this need for catharsis and to feel heard through my writing.
That's what's up. Did you ever get down with Goosebumps?
No, I didn't.
Oh my God. So I had such a huge Goosebumps collection, but I didn't really read them. I only enjoyed, the main reason I enjoyed them was because of the covers, but I hardly freaking read them, but I had a shit ton of them. So
I mean, that's a good a reason as any.
So, like, were you into comics and stuff at that point when you were younger, in like 7, 8 or so?
Sort of. I was into superheroes, but I didn't read comics. So I was like a fake fan. I was into like superheroes and stuff, and just going to see whatever movies existed, because there weren't many when I was a kid. But whatever movies existed about superheroes, at least not compared to now. I'm sure there are many, but just not in theaters and stuff like that. I used to really like Wolverine and X-Men and stuff like that. But yeah, I was a fake fan reading the comics.
So once you started delving more seriously into writing and literature, who were some authors that you started to go hard in the paint for?
Well, when I got into serious writing, it wasn't really novel writing at first. It was mostly screenplays. So I started writing screenplays when I was like 12 or 13. And trying to think of what some of my biggest like film influences were.
And was that because you were more interested in film at that point in time?
I think so. I think I wasn't interested in seeing them portrayed on screen, but I used to say I liked screenwriting better because you didn't have to worry about flowery language. You know, with a screenplay, you still have to write it well and watch like your diction and word repetition and stuff like that. But it's not like you're writing a novel necessarily.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking, like, do you think it has more to do with the fact, like you were saying, right, with a screenplay, you're more focused on the dialogue of a character and another character? Do you think that had something to do with it, where you were more interested in delving into, conversations and dialogue?
Yeah. I think so, definitely. I was more interested in like character arcs and stuff like that. Although, I was like 14, so I fucking sucked at character arcs. But like I was interested in studying a character and just the plot rather than how you describe the plot. So I didn't want to worry about, any of the formal writing in a novel rather than structuring a plot.
That's so interesting. And I guess that makes sense, right? If you were younger starting out with writing comics, right, that's going to be sort of the same kind of a thing where you're really focused more on the dialogue between characters. So that totally makes sense.
I have never drawn that connection before. You just blew my mind.
So once you really started taking writing seriously, was it difficult for you to find and hone your style and your voice that you wanted to convey in your writing?
A little bit when I changed to novel writing, because I had been trying to like actually write a novel since I was like 16 or 17, but I didn't have a strong voice outside of my screenplay voice, which doesn't really fit a novel format because, again, you're not like writing in novel form. You're writing much more bare prose. And so it was always difficult for me to do that, also because I didn't know how to really transition plot structuring in a movie into a book. So I was trying to find my voice, and it was very difficult. So I ended up just sort of giving up and sticking to screenplays until about, I think, the Misophorism trilogy is when I finally completed one. And by then, I had found a voice, which was sort of a mesh. I read a lot of philosophy in like books from 1950 or so in high school, and I hope that doesn't sound self-aggrandizing. I didn't understand half of it, but I read a lot of books like that, so my prose and voice in the Misophorism trilogy kind of reflected like this sort of 1800 style voice, and that was for like the Headless Nobleman, although it's not as strong there. The Headless Nobleman and In The Last Man Blinks, I literally just use my own voice. Like how I'm talking right now is how that book is written. So I think partially what helped me find my voice was writing dialogue in movies and writing different characters with different voices. And so I was able to sort of translate that into the Misophorism trilogy where each part of the book had a different voice, if that makes sense. Yeah,
I feel like it's got to be such a big transition going from writing screenplays to writing a novel. Like, I'm just thinking, I love Cormac McCarthy, and some of his novels, there is not a ton of dialogue, and so much of the story is just him describing shit. And just thinking about how difficult that could be at times to just describe the minutia of a certain scene or whatever you're trying to depict, especially when you're coming from writing screenplays and just focusing on the dialogue.
Oh, yeah. I think some of that might still be left over in a way because I was reading Asylum piece. I don't know how to say her last name. Anna Kavon? I was reading Asylum piece by her, and she describes so much. And by contrast, I don't describe things a whole lot because of that screenplay background. I think I like to focus on the ideas in the work rather than what things look like. And it's not a bad thing to describe stuff by any means, but I think by coming from that background and writing To Sing of Damnation, there is a lot of describing in To Sing of Damnation, but it's not like Asylum piece where she's like describing the color of the sky and using metaphors and how the grass is doing this and that. And it's beautiful writing, but I don't personally write like that.
So at what point then did you begin to work on the Misophorism trilogy, or at least some of the material and stories that would become the trilogy?
I think the Misophorism trilogy, I say at the end that it's existed in various forms since 2017. I think that's the date I gave. And it's because part of the Misophorism trilogy is memoir, and I've been sort of trying to write stories about things I had been through for a long time. But I think like actual writing started in February 19 with The Headless Nobleman. And at first it wasn't really meant to be a trilogy. I just wanted to do like a zine. But as I wrote The Headless Nobleman, I got really into that writing style and the way I was telling the story. And once I had finished, I just sort of impulsively started on The Last Man Blinks. And The Last Man Blinks was it was a really hard time while I was writing The Last Man Blinks. It was incredibly difficult. Not because the story was difficult, but like I was so depressed that I like couldn't get out of bed to do anything but write The Last Man Blinks. And once I got near the end of that, I was like, this is going to be a trilogy, because I noticed how many, and it was intentional, but I also noticed unintentional mirrors between The Headless Nobleman and The Last Man Blinks. And I wanted to sort of do that with handwritten eulogies and make it all one big philosophy called Misophorism. So, to loop back to the original question, it started around February 2019.
So when you realized that, hey, I think this is going to wind up being a trilogy, were you like daunted by that? Were you overwhelmed by that? Or you were like, I want to do this. I want to put out a trilogy.
Yeah, it was like, I want to put out a trilogy because the books themselves are like so short. Like each one is about 60 pages. So like, the trilogy is a bit of a lie, but at the same time it's not, because it's a trilogy of novellas. So like, by the time I had decided I wanted to make it a trilogy, I already had done most of the work. So I was like, yeah, this is gonna be fucking cool. I'm gonna love it. I'm going to do it. And so I did do it, and I'm pretty proud of it. But yeah, you
should be, dude. You should be, man.
Thank you.
I mean, writing is not easy at all. And to even, I know you're saying like, they're only 60 pages long and they're novellas. Like that's fucking work, man. And you know how much work goes into putting that stuff together. So yeah, you should absolutely be proud of that.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. It was a bit of a pain to write it at times, but the painful part is editing, not writing. Writing is fun.
Where'd you get the title Misophorism?
So I got the title from the actual philosophy of Misophorism, which I made up in the last book. And Misophorism basically stands for, so if you take, I think it's Greek roots, miso means hate, and for means life, so it combines to mean a hatred of life. And that's basically the running theme through the book, and it essentially, the philosophy means that because there's so much suffering in the world, and we all accept that life is hard, it is not morally justifiable to continue the human race. And I don't believe that, disclaimer, but that's basically what it means, and that theme runs through the whole trilogy for different reasons. In The Headless Nobleman, the reason is that God does exist, but he's purposely torturing humankind. And The Last Man Blinks, it's that we have this innate lie in ourselves that living is worthwhile. And in handwritten eulogies, it's basically, all of these people are ignorant and continuing human society, so we have to save them from themselves.
Because you had sent me to Sing of Damnation, and those themes are, you could tell very clearly that those are going to be themes explored in your writing. Were those themes that, as you were setting out writing this story and this trilogy, that they just kind of came organically, or did you sit down and say, I want this project to delve specifically into these themes and these topics?
It did sort of come organic. Well, it was a little of both. So I knew I wanted to write about death because everything I write is about death. But as far as what each book was going to be about, that just sort of came organically. With The Last Man Blinks in particular, I just went into it saying, I want to narrate this as myself and make it as cathartic as possible. So, like, in that book, I'm talking about how I'm a piece of shit and deserve to die and so on and so forth. But, the theme of, our bodies are lying to us with the idea that living is worthwhile just sort of popped up in Meyer's rationalization. So I would say that with The Sing of Damnation, it was incredibly purposeful, but with the Misophorism trilogy, it sort of just came up as I was writing.
What is it about death that you find so intriguing, or at least the theme of death?
That's a tough question. I think that I have been suicidal for a great portion of my life, and if you're suicidal, you have to think about death. And so I've thought about death a lot, and I'm also drawn to philosophy, which at least philosophy, well, all of philosophy really deals with the topic of death, from Stoic philosophy to absurdist philosophy like Camus. And so the idea of death and that it happens to all of us is something that's like on my mind all the time. And just, I exist. The fact that I exist and looking at this massive, meaningless universe and the idea of a character struggling to find meaning against this aberrant void that's endless is so dark and bleak, and it's really appealing to me. And just from like my personal life, I haven't had a whole lot of people in my life die. There's been 2 big ones, but I've struggled with meaning a lot because, like, I suffer from bipolar 2, and I go into some really, really bad depressive fits. And when I'm in that depression, it's sort of like, well, why am I suffering through this? What's the point of staying around if it's going to be mostly suffering? And so the question that follows is, well, what does this mean? Because if you can find meaning, then you can rationalize staying around. So that meaning of death and life is something I'm really drawn to as a result, because I think about death so much. Not in the suicidal sense, I should say that. I'm not going to kill myself.
I mentioned this on here before. I'm not religious. I don't believe in God or anything like that. So the thought of us being on a fucking floating rock in this gigantic, expansive void and what our existence means sometimes fucks me up, man. Yeah. Because it's just like, it's such a wild thing to think about.
Yeah.
When you're putting these thoughts and these themes down and you're writing them, do you ever have a hesitation or kind of feel like you want to hold back in sharing some of this stuff? Or do you feel like nothing is off limits and you're down to write about whatever, as long as you feel it's true to what you want to convey and it works well within the story you're trying to put together?
I guess it depends on what it is. If it comes to my life, there's no holds barred. I will say fucking every little intimate detail about my life. But just like more generally, there are some things I hesitate to write about. Like particularly sexual assault, unless it's like autobiographical. I tend to avoid that completely. And just like stuff I don't experience, I guess. Like at one point I had a trans character and I wasn't going to write about transphobia because that is not something I experienced, so I would completely fuck it up. So I mean, I could always get like trans people's input and stuff like that, but I don't want to risk messing it up, So, but when it comes to those dark themes, I generally just go for whatever, especially if it's something I've experienced. The Misophorism trilogy pretty much has every dark thing I can think of in there. There's cannibalism, there's suicide, there's persecution, there's insanity, there's a ton of dark shit in there. And when I was writing it at the time, I was just like, this is pretty fucking cool. I didn't really, think of it as like, wow, this is bleak as fuck. One of my friends read the Misophorism trilogy, and I got to handwritten eulogies, and they create morticium in there, which is basically grinding bones down to dust and then putting them on food and eating it. And he was like, I had to skip that part because it was like too gruesome. And when I was writing it, I didn't even think about it like that. I just thought it was cool.
What's interesting, man, is like stuff like that in writing, I don't know if maybe because I think sometimes when I read, sometimes I struggle with the visualization of what I'm what I'm reading. I don't visualize it as well. So stuff like that doesn't tend to bother me. Like going back to Cormac McCarthy. Oh my God, what is the one book? I think it's Blood Meridian. I was going to say Blood Horizon. Blood Meridian. It's a fantastic fucking book, and it's set after the Civil War, and these basically bandits who are just going around killing Native Americans for money.
Damn.
And there's some gruesome fucking scenes in that book, man. Like absolutely gruesome. And at the time I was reading it, I didn't think too much of it. And then my wife read it and she's like, dude, that book was gruesome as fuck. Like, how did you feel during certain parts? It's like, it doesn't bother me. But then sometimes when I'm watching movies and I see gruesome shit depicted, I sometimes am like, oh boy, I can't handle it as much.
I'm the same way, honestly. Like, I mentioned The Savage God earlier, and that's like a very, very thorough study on suicide. And there's like some gruesome fucking shit in there. This wasn't particularly gruesome. It wasn't gruesome at all, actually, but it's like a sort of funny tidbit. Basically, he told this story of this guy who was invited to go to dinner, and he wrote back, and he's like, oh, thank you for inviting me dinner, but unfortunately I have an appointment to shoot myself, and I can't miss that. So, like, there's, like, some really fucking bleak shit in there, and, he describes trying to kill himself at the end, because there's a memoir of Sylvia Plath at the beginning, and then there's a memoir of his own suicide attempt, and it is incredibly detailed, as well as, like, what he experienced when he was in the hospital after, and it didn't bother me at all, but I'm sure if I, like, saw that in a movie, I would, like, hate it.
Do you feel like that sort of imagery, that sort of stuff that you're depicting in your stories, do you feel that, it could be tough for people to consume, or do you feel that it can be very, I don't want to say uplifting, that's not the right word that's coming to mind, but cathartic?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, part of why I depict stuff like that is because I want the audience to suffer with me. It's the best way I can put it. Like, I want to craft a story that puts the audience through the same emotions that I'm experiencing. Not that I'm a cannibal or anything like that, but just that,
you
like,
sick fuck.
just that I like go through some pretty low periods, and in order to convey that, I want the audience to get to know a character who also goes through those low periods through very intense situations.
When I listen to music or, watch stuff that's super sad or, consume any sort of media that is delving into, sadder or morose subject matter, I feel like it is very, very cathartic.
Yeah.
I feel like there is definitely a time and a place for enjoying happy-go-lucky sort of content, but I do think, when you're struggling with certain emotions or certain thoughts, there is definitely something cathartic about reading a story or listening to music that delves into, depressing shit.
Yeah, and that's part of, like, the reason I write. Like, I grew up and still listen to some pretty fucking sad music. In fact, that's, like, all I listen to. And it provides me with so much catharsis that I want to grant that to someone else. I want to be able to have someone else read the trilogy despite how bleak and depressing it is, and the fact that I don't think there's one single positive line in the book. At one point in The Last Man Blinks, I say that maybe I can rationalize living, and immediately after I'm like, no, I couldn't. That was stupid bullshit. So, like, there's like nothing positive about that book, but I've had people like come to me and tell me that they really loved it and thought it was tragically beautiful and stuff like that. And when someone actually said they read The Last Man Blinks, and they came up to me and they were like, my daughter committed suicide, and reading this book really, like, made me connect with her and put me in her shoes. And that was fucking flooring to hear. It made me,
dude, like, I was gonna say, like, holy shit, dude.
it made me so fucking emotional hearing that.
Oh, I can't even imagine, man.
I'm just glad I gave or was able to give somebody that connection and that catharsis, because that is certainly traumatic and tragic to go through. And I hope that helped her get some closure, if anything else.
Yeah, that's nuts, man. Dude, one of the things that I really enjoy is that you include images in your writing.
Yeah.
And I love that. You know, where did that kind of come from? What made you want to include these images?
Part of it was seeing how Dan Barrett did it in Death Consciousness. And I thought it was really cool. And I also, independently from that, sort of wanted to give it this archaic feeling to it. Because The Last Man Blinks, I'm narrating it, so there are no images because it's modern day. But in Handwritten Eulogies and The Headless Nobleman, there are images that make it feel old. And I would just really like the look that they create for the chapters. And if I'm writing something that has diction that is sort of archaic, I love to include images in it, because I feel like it sort of helps with the experience and sort of paints a picture of it being fairly old, even if it is.
Yeah, I love it because I feel like like you're saying, I feel like it helps set the tone of what you're going to be reading.
Yeah, I'm glad it does. I'm glad it actually does help, because I really love just like tone setting. I scratched this project a while back, and the first line of the book is something like, 5 years ago I killed a man. And that like really tells you what you're in for. And that was something I sort of learned from one of my biggest influences, Albert Camus, because I know in The Stranger, he goes something like, Mama died yesterday or the day before, I don't know, which tells you about the entire book going forward. And I'm trying to think of another book that does that. I think The Stranger does it really well, and reading that was a massive influence on me. And the first line of The Last Man Blinks is something like, in 2016, I tried to kill myself. My hands collapsed around my throat. So, stuff like that. I like to let the audience know what the fuck they're getting into.
When you were putting this together, the stories for this trilogy, did you have any idea that it was going to be published?
No fucking idea. Absolutely no idea. I wrote it with the thought that the most it was going to go is that I would put it in my Instagram bio, like the link to the PDF or something. And my friend showed me a site where I could get it printed, and I got like a few copies printed, thinking that no one would want to read it, and I would like hand them out at work, and it got like much fucking bigger than I thought it was going to get, to the point where like people I only knew online were ordering books to have them shipped to their houses, and that was like insane already. But when it was published on the Flenser, God, that was fucking nuts, because I've been like a Flenser fan since, God, it's been ages.
Dude, when I saw that announcement, I was like, yo, holy shit, that's awesome as fuck.
Yeah, it was, thank you. It was definitely like fucking overwhelming in a good way.
Oh my God, I can't even imagine, man. Because yeah, I know even before the Flenser was publishing the trilogy, you're very active in the Facebook group. You know, you and I have gotten to know each other from me doing the podcast. And so yeah, when I saw that announcement, I was like, yo, fuck yes, man.
Well, thanks. I can't even describe how I felt. I guess jubilant is the best answer.
That's a good word. I like that word, jubilant.
I like it too. Whenever I find a word that sounds cool, I make a point to use it in the book. But at the same time, you have to be like familiar with the word so it doesn't look forced. So I have to, slip it in the conversation or something. And I feel like jubilant is one of those words. But
hell yeah.
Yeah, it was crazy.
How did Jonathan how did you guys wind up talking about publishing the trilogy?
It was sort of like random, I guess. because we were friends on Facebook and we had talked a little bit before that. We had talked quite a bit, actually. And I moderate the subreddits for Have a Nice Life, for the Flenser, for some other subreddits like Daughters, I almost said for some other Daughters. So I had been in contact with him before, and once the Flenser group was made, we started talking more, and then I was a moderator in that. And one day he was just like, hey, you want to put your book in the store? And I was like, fuck yes, I do. So, yeah, I don't know what prompted that, or at least I don't remember it, but it was like, it's like the favorite message I've ever received.
Yo, that's dope, man. That's so awesome. And I mean, I just feel like your work fits so well with the Flenser and the music that the Flenser is putting out, right? And knowing that you're such a big Flenser fan, I feel like it's just like such a great partnership, man. And so, yeah, I'm super pumped that the Flenser was able to. And dude, it sold out, man.
Yeah, it did, which is nuts. There was this thread on Twitter that was like, Black horror artist, put your work below and I'll retweet it. And it was like this big account. And I put the Misophorism Trilogy there, and I was like, this isn't horror in like the traditional sense. It's like existential horror, like Thomas Ligotti, and clipping ordered by book.
Yeah,
like
man.
The artist
dude,
clipping.
I saw that. Yeah. So awesome, dude.
And I think once he did, other people were like buying it, and it sold out, which is nuts.
That's so awesome, dude.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you guys know when there's going to be more of the books available to purchase?
For the Misophorism Trilogy?
Yeah.
Very soon. The books are shipping now, or they've been shipped, so they will be back very, very soon.
I'm assuming the pandemic has probably halted shit, right?
Yeah, it's at least slower, but they're produced in America, so they're able to ship, but it is probably going to be slower.
Now that you are, I would say, a part of the Flens family, what makes the Flenser so special to you?
I think it's the honesty. Like, the running theme in everything the Flenser puts out and everything the Flenser does is a profound sense of honesty and down-to-earthness and rawness. And, like, Jonathan himself and everyone on the Flenser and the music that they put out. Like, you fucking listen to Street Sex, and on And I Grew Into Ribbons, he's saying he gets tired of trying to convince himself not to pull the trigger. And that is something like brutally honest to put in a song. Mm-hmm. It's something that doesn't have any filter. You're flat out saying how you feel. Not that songs that talk through metaphor and stuff are bad, but it's just so honest and raw. And I feel like everything the Flenser does is down to earth and done with such care for other people that it really just makes me feel comfortable. It makes me feel at home. And I feel like it's almost familial in a way. Like it's a family. And I'm always drawn to communities and places that feel like family. And I think the Flenser very much does that. And that's in part due to the music being so depressing and raw, because people who really connect with vulnerability are drawn to it. And I am definitely one of those people.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said to a T, man. Like Jonathan and the bands that Jonathan works with have done such a great job at making music that is so fucking honest, so raw. And like you said, I feel like, especially with the Facebook group, man, there is really a community that has been able to grow and become cultivated through this record label. And it's kind of nuts, man. Like, you know, over the years, I've been fans of other record labels, but none to the level of the Flenser.
Yeah, me too. I just think that, you know, I got into them from Have a Nice Life. I think I found Death Consciousness when I was like 15 on YouTube, because I had like, this is going to sound really fucking dorky, but I was writing a screenplay on archangels and archdemons, and I looked up angelic metal. That's the dorky part. To like find something that would fit the sort of idea of power, of holy power that I wanted, holy wrath, all that. And because of the keywords, I looked up angelic metal, Weighing Souls with Sand by the Angelic Process showed up. And I listened to that, and it oddly enough fit exactly what I was looking for. And I liked the video, and because I liked the video, Death Consciousness showed up on my recommended. And I was like, hey, I know that painting. So I listened to it, and it quickly became my favorite record ever. And from there, I got into Planning for Burial, and then the Flenser, then Drowse, then pretty much everyone else. So yeah, I happened upon it by sheer chance, really. But I think that I probably eventually would have come to the Flenser because I was just a big music fan. And by delving in deeper, I would have discovered Death Consciousness eventually. And by discovering Death Consciousness, I would have discovered the Flenser and loved it either way.
Yeah, I mean, I have said this so many times in this podcast, man, but the Flenser, Jonathan the Flenser, he's got his thumb on the pulse for really great artists and really great music that are making some of, like you said, the most honest, raw, unique music out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's something I try to capture in my writing. I want to be fucking raw and honest and just put myself out there, because one thing that's weird about me is I'm not particularly attached to my past or anything. It just feels like an event. So when I go into something like the Misophorism trilogy, I'm like, well, I'm going to use this as a plot point now. So by making it raw and honest, I feel like the Flenser and its artist taught me how to be raw and honest with my art. And I am internally grateful for that. Eternally grateful, not internally.
It's interesting you say that, man. I mean, just in dealing with anxiety and depression, for years, that was stuff I felt very hesitant to share with others. And once I just started to discover certain bands on the Flenser and seeing them talk about stuff, for me, it made me feel more comfortable in being able to share with others the shit that I was going through. And I think I had this, I think Kyle and I talked about this to some degree when I had him on the podcast. But I think you're 100% right, that vulnerability and that, again, that honesty that a lot of the artists on the Flenser put into their music is, I think, bar none, man.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's rare to find an artist, especially like Drowse that you bring up, Kyle, where he just flat out talks about bipolar. And if I remember correctly, there's a song on Cold Air, and it's, I think, his mom describing a suicide attempt of his, and that is
oh, dude, how fucking how tough it, well, I shouldn't say how tough it is for you, but dude, listening to that album and specifically hearing the recordings of his mother talk about that stuff, dude, that is fucking tough, man. I've mentioned this before, sometimes when I listen to that album, I when I'm listening to it, it's usually because I'm in a dark space. I'm like, oh boy, here we go. I'm in a bad way.
Yeah. There is definitely, the weird thing about me is that I listen to the same music when I'm sad and when I'm happy, but it almost feels and sounds different when I'm in a dark place. And Cold Air is definitely one of those albums. I think the album I find myself going to the most are the two albums. One is A Promise by Shoo Shoo, and the other is Hospice by the Antlers, because I relate to that album pretty heavily. So when I'm in a dark space or reliving some bad memories, those two albums really just draw me in. And Cold Air is one of those albums too.
Interestingly enough, Cold Air is one of the only albums that does that for me. Midwife, like Author, like Daughter, did do that for me, but I've gotten over that hump with that album. Yeah. Cold Air is really the only album that does that, man, which is kind of interesting. The, what is it called? I think is it called I'm Gonna Do It? The Giles Corey song.
Yeah, I'm Going to Do It. Yeah.
Yeah, that song on that album is one where I'm like, all right, I'm think I'm gonna skip this one. But Cold Air is one of the only albums that I can think of that does that to me.
I think that my favorite albums are albums that are like that for me. I'm trying to think of my top 5. I think my top 5 would be something like Death Consciousness, Hospice, A Promise, You Won't Get What You Want by Daughters, and I won't apologize for this last one, The Black Parade by My Chemical Romance. And that one just like dealing with themes of death and decay is something, you know, I connect with a lot considering the themes in my work and all that.
Dude, I don't know if I could put together like just 5 of my top favorite albums, because there's so many albums that I love. And especially I have certain albums that are like, oh, these are going to be my albums that I'm going to listen to in the summer when I'm hanging, my wife and I are going on trips, or these are going to be the albums that I'm going to listen to during the winter when I'm being gloomy as fuck. So that would be so hard. I definitely have albums that are like some of my all-time favorite, but to pick 5 albums would be so hard for me.
I did one of those like Topster things where you pick like 42 of your favorite albums, and it was fucking difficult. So I feel you. It's really hard.
Oh, dude, I feel like it'd be so tough.
I know my most recent edition was like End Position, which I gave a 10 because that album is so fucking good. It's one of my favorite albums of all time now. It's bewildering how good that album is.
Now, to kind of go back to writing, what sort of stuff do you enjoy reading at this point in time?
Right now, I'm reading Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre, however you say his name. And that is fairly dark from what I've seen so far. And I just finished, I've mentioned it a couple times, I think, The Savage God, A Study of Suicide, which is really, really fucking good. It is probably one of the darkest things I've read. And I really like writing, but reading dark shit, because it gives me a ton of writing inspiration to see other authors tackle the same things I am.
Oh, I'm sure. So I'm assuming then that primarily you like to read more philosophy-driven sort of narratives or writing as opposed to just straight up fiction.
Yeah, it's both like philosophy, and sometimes I do enjoy fiction a lot, but philosophy is a big thing for me.
What about music, man? What sort of stuff have you been listening to lately?
I've been listening to pretty much exclusively Street Sex at this point. And Street Sex is really sort of influencing me right now. I think I take the bulk of my inspiration from music. So, like, Street Sex being so pessimistic and bleak and distrusting of others is really just pushing me in my work to write a concept like that. And I've been listening to, besides that, before Street Sex, because I do this weird thing where I'm obsessed with just one artist and I don't listen to anything else. But before that, I was listening to a lot of Mama Lake.
Oh,
and
dude, how fucking good is that album?
So fucking good, man.
It's like it's on another level. Incredible.
Yeah, it's almost like something I've never ever heard before. How it fuses like blues and jazz,
absolutely wild,
into metal. It's
it's
crazy.
I'm the opposite of you. I will definitely go hard in the paint for certain bands or albums, but I have to have a rotation of somewhere between like 7 to 10 albums that I'm diving into. And so with Come and See, how it's been going lately is I'll usually listen to that in the morning sometime when I'm working, and then later in the evening, whether I'm working on stuff or if I'm playing Star Wars, that is like right now that's one of my go-to. All right, I'm going to play some video games. I'm popping that on, and Autumn for, oh my God, what's their name? In Autumn for Crippled Children. Like, I've been playing those 2 albums back to back whenever I'm doing shit at night.
Yeah, I do that sometimes. What I usually do is I like make a playlist for a certain artist and have all of their work on there, or what I like of their work on there, and just play that all the way through when I'm doing something. Or when I'm playing games or something like that. That's like my go-to form of listening to music. And so I have a Street Sex album with like everything they've done on it. And yeah, I just pretty much stick to like one artist for like a month or two. And then
yeah,
I'll move on to
I know
something else.
Jonathan, and when I had him on the podcast, he talked about that with me, and I did that a couple of times with a couple of artists, and now I'm drawing a blank on who I did it with. But one band that because they don't have a ton of material, that I will do that with when I get into modes when I'm listening to them is Paolo. So they have an LP and 2 EPs, and I fucking love their music.
Oh yeah.
And so they're a band that when I'm in a Paolo mode, I will just go and listen to everything that's up on Spotify of theirs.
That's pretty much how I am, but all the time. Yeah, it was in order. Well, going back in time. Now it's Street Sex. It was Mama Leak, then My Chemical Romance, and before that it was Shoo Shoo. I listened to a ton of fucking Shoo Shoo. They're such a good band. Jamie is like,
dude, his music is insane. You know, and you and I have talked about this. I've talked about it on the podcast before, but I was definitely biased against his music for a very long time. And it wasn't until recently, you being one of the individuals telling me you got to check out his music, where I was just like, when I finally did again, it's just like, holy shit, man.
Yeah, it's crazy how someone can capture so much anguish in a song. I mean, I think, like, with Blacks, in particular off of A Promise, that song is like auditory suffering to me. It's like auditory suicide ideation. And very few bands can do that. And the fact that Jamie consistently does that with every release is, like, crazy to me. He's such a consistent artist. I don't think I have an album I, like, dislike. I like most of their work. I have some albums I kind of like meh on, but nothing I dislike.
And I feel like too with his music, no one makes music like Shoo Shoo.
Yeah.
Right? Like no one makes music like his. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's so unique. And I think like the fact that he manages to switch up such an idiosyncratic style on every single album, like A Promise and Forget both sound like Shoo Shoo, but they don't sound anything like each other. And I think you have to be a very talented individual to do that.
It's almost surprising, and I know Jonathan has mentioned this when I have had him on the podcast, but it's almost surprising that Shoo Shoo has not put out a release on the Flenser, because I feel like Shoo Shoo would just be so perfect for the Flenser.
Oh, yeah. Especially, like, I could definitely see some of their early work, like, fitting in the Flenser catalog.
Oh, absolutely.
And even some of their later work, like Girl with Basket of Fruit.
Mm-hmm. So, shit, man. So, we talked about a ton of stuff, but as far as what you've got coming up, things you're working on, I know, obviously, shit's wild right now, but what are some things that you've got coming up? What are some things that you plan to work on? Or what are some things that people can keep an eye out for?
The Flenser and I are coming out with To Sing of Damnation soon, which is a religious mystery based around this guy named Jordan, who one day finds himself possessed by a demon. And at first the haunting is pretty mild. It's like this daily thought, which is Eketil sits, rife with slander, in the heavenly sanctum, beseeching the damned. He's able to ignore it for a while until he starts hearing snaps in his house, and he's like, alright, well, now I gotta investigate this. And the path he goes down is pretty fucking bleak and filled with suffering, but he's like, I gotta figure out who Eketil is, gotta figure out who this demon Tharath, who's possessed me, is, and I have to figure out why I've been possessed and what they want. And the book centers around that, and I am very, very proud of that. It's like my favorite thing I've ever written. So that will be out soon. And I am very excited for everyone to read that. As far as beyond that, I finished my third book while I was editing The Sing of Damnation. That won't be out for a while. But I did finish that. It's called... Actually, I'm not sure if I should say the name. I'm not sure. Jonathan would be mad. So I'll abstain from doing that. But, yeah, The Sing of Damnation's coming out, and I'm very excited for that.
Hell yeah, man. That's what's up. Well, Adam, dude, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. Dude, this was a blast, man. I'm so glad I was able to get you on and we could have this awesome conversation.
Yeah, it was really fun. Thank you for having me on.
I've said this multiple times. The podcast was definitely never meant to be a political podcast by any means. But I'm someone that is very left-leaning, and I think that for me, not sharing some of my beliefs and views on how I think the inequities in our society, or maybe just how our society could be more equal and more open to all walks of life, has been something that has come out over the episodes of doing this podcast. And I think especially with what's going on in America and throughout the globe right now, that keep up the pressure. Speak out against institutions or systems of inequality, whether they are small or big. Keep up that pressure. Speak out against those systems, because that shit matters, man. And what we're seeing happening right now is something that is as awesome as it is sad. Sad because I wish that we didn't have to waste our time and energy to fight for equality for whomever. All walks of life, right? But especially for people of color at this point in time, right? It also makes me happy that people are coming together to say enough is enough, fuck this shit. We need to live in a world and in a society that is more equal for everyone. So I think for my final episode, it's only appropriate that I end this by saying continue to speak out, continue to challenge systems and institutions that are racist, that are unequal, that are harmful to our environment, to our society, to us as human beings. Push back against institutions like policing institutions that are absolutely racist as hell. And let your voice be heard. Let people know that we are ready for goddamn change, not just in America, but globally. So yeah, keep speaking out. Keep up the pressure. Black lives fucking matter. Black trans lives matter. LGBTQ lives matter. And we should be living in a society that is fucking equal for everyone, regardless of your gender, the color of your skin, or whatever. And arrest the fucking cops that killed Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain. So shit, with all that said, guys, go follow Adam, go buy his book from the Flenser. Dude, go flood all of your money to the Flenser, go flood all your money to Adam, go flood your money to every single freaking band or artist that has come onto this podcast over the years. I don't think you guys need me to tell you how important music and art is, but especially at a time like right now, music and fucking art is so important. So support your favorite musicians, support your favorite artists as much as you can. And I hope that once this COVID shit gets under control, we get another Flenser Showcase show. Because I know Jonathan has said it's still going to happen. So I'm holding you to it, Jonathan. I cannot wait to get another Flenser Showcase show. So as always, guys, get out there, create something cool. I will see you around.